So the columnist E.J. Dionne has a new piece for the Washington Post with this headline: Progressives should defend Biden's legacy to protect their future. And E.J. writes in part this: the trickiest problem for Democrats and progressives in the coming months will not be finding a new electoral strategy. A far more pressing imperative is to prevent Donald Trump's victory from discrediting Biden's genuinely impressive accomplishments and the course he set for the country, which was broadly correct. The truth about the Biden economy should not be lost in the mire of political defeat and messaging failure. It's a reality that will make it much easier to defend his domestic policy legacy. Defending this legacy is vital to battling against a sharp rightward turn in economic policy. Nicole Hemmer, a history professor at Vanderbilt University, argues this defense is equally important to preventing resignation from the left. One close election, she says, should not be misinterpreted as a mandate for abandoning pro-worker and pro-union approaches or a strong industrial policy. How Biden's term is remembered is not just about him, it's about the future. So, Adrian, of course, you're very familiar with the idea of defending President Biden's accomplishments and legacy. It does seem like right now, in the aftermath of the vice president's defeat, a lot of even Democrats are kind of running away from what the White House did over 4 years, even though those inside the West Wing are confident that history will regard them favorably, their legislative accomplishments at the very least. What is the challenge here for Democrats? How do you navigate this?
Well, a couple of things. Number one, I mean, we have to really reflect on the fact that President Biden, it wasn't even the first 4 years, it was the first 18 to 19 months of his presidency, passed 4 major economic bills. We talked about this last week on the show, Joe. Can you imagine where America's economy would be right now if we had not passed the American Rescue Plan after COVID and make sure that we could, reduce inflation as much as we possibly could? And when you look at where the U.S. inflation numbers are compared to some of the other industrialized nations, I mean, we were doing far better off during COVID. You can't always say that to voters, but that's just the bottom line. So,
and by the way, that is so important, Adrian. I've been talking about went overseas this weekend, talked to a lot of business leaders, talked to a lot of political leaders. Mm-hmm. They're all talking about basically the U.S. economic miracle. They're all, I've got to say, they're all downbeat.
Yeah.
Because they're kind of asking, how do we get here? What you guys have in America, because that gulf is widening between American prosperity and, I'll just say it, the EU and Britain's downturn. I mean, and my God, you look what's happening in France. You look at what's happening in Germany.
Yep.
Everybody in London this weekend were laughing. They said, okay, so let's get this straight. Italy is the most stable democracy over there, and Greece is one of the most stable economies. Things have flipped upside down, but China's in an economic mess. You go around the world, and I will say, I know people now will be going like, Biden's had this horrible term, et cetera, et cetera. I remember when I got elected in '94, everybody was looking back. And they said, wait a second, George H.W. Bush was supposed to have such a horrible economy. The economy was turning around his fourth quarter. And if the election had been 2 months later, he would have won.
Right.
We don't have to wait. I understand there are people that were struggling with gas prices and people struggling with groceries. But these numbers 2, 3, 4 years from now are going to have a lot of people looking back, scratching their head going, wait a second, what? Why were people saying the economy was bad? And as David French has said, Russia's at its weakest that it's been in a generation. Mm-hmm. Iran's at its weakest since 1979. Hezbollah's destroyed. Hamas pretty much destroyed. And yes, that would have never happened without Joe Biden. I understand they're all very, very messy situations. And one side wanted him to go further. One side didn't want him to go. But the balancing act there has left Donald Trump and the administration coming in, as David said, on foreign policy with some incredible opportunities. And economically, again, somebody inside there's got to say, don't rock the boat too much.
That's right. Donald Trump, just like he inherited President Obama's strong economy, he's going to inherit President Biden's strong economy. That's just the bottom line. Because President Biden did use a lot of capital to get some of these bipartisan bills passed. I mean, you look at the CHIPS and Science Act. I worked at the Department of Commerce and helped implement that. I mean, a lot of the benefits that will happen through the CHIPS and Science Act will happen under President Trump's administration as long as he doesn't do anything to dismantle it. So the bottom line is this. President Biden got a lot done, historic achievements. There's no question about that. We as Democrats have just got to do a better job of communicating to working class voters. Even if those working class voters aren't feeling it, you have to say, look, I understand inflation is high. I understand grocery prices are high, gas prices. We are working to lower those prices, but also we feel your pain. I think Democrats, and again, it was not the fault of one politician, one elected official in the last 4 years. It was the collective fault of Democrats across the board that we just have a problem trying to connect the dots with the policies that we're passing that help the very voters out there who voted against us. And we've got to figure out how to square that and how to get back on track with the very people who are the foundation of the Democratic Party.
Well, and a guy from your home state, Bill Clinton.
Pretty good at that.
He's pretty darn good at that. I always said I never understood why Democratic politicians didn't have a band that said WWBD. What would Bubba do? Because when I asked him about the election, Rev, he said, and I brought up that I was talking about democracy. I was talking about violent rhetoric. I was talking about fascist rhetoric. I was talking about things that bothered me, that I was worried about. But he basically said, Joe, you got people that were worried about gas prices. You got people that were worried about, other things like that. They never got to where you were worried about. And Bill Clinton said, you've got to meet them where they are.
You've got to meet them where they are. You have to address their concerns and then raise the other economic issues. You can't go macro without dealing with the micro concerns. But at the same time, I think that the Democratic Party and the progressives need to really do a better job at amplifying what Biden did. Because if they don't, I agree with the Times column, that if they don't, they are also dislodging themselves to be able to come in the midterm elections and other things. Joe Biden did some very solid things, transformative things. Even I was telling fellow civil rights leaders, black unemployment is lower than it's been in decades. He just appointed more black women as federal judges than anybody in the history of this country. Nobody's talking about that. He just gave clemency for 1,500 people in one day. That's never happened. And 39 pardons. And I hope he continues that. I want to see Marilyn Mosby with a pardon, Jesse Jackson Jr. with a pardon. But if nobody's talking about this, we would let Donald Trump dictate the narrative that this was all 4 years of failure. We made more progress for working class people and communities of color under Biden. Not everything we wanted, not nearly everything we wanted, but more than we had gotten under preceding presidents. And we need to brag about that rather than sit in the trauma unit that we lost an election by less than 2%.
1% of the popular vote, less than 1% in Wisconsin, about 1.2% in Michigan, about 1.5% in Pennsylvania. And that's the difference in the election. So this idea that, everybody's fighting everybody right now. And everybody's screaming. And everybody's looking at Joe Biden as a failure, when the fact is, you just said it, unemployment, long-term unemployment, lower than any time in 40 years. As you said, black unemployment, lower than it's been in a generation. The U.S. dollar, stronger than it's been in 50 years over the Biden term. You look at the stock market, something that Donald Trump and a lot of his supporters look at all the time, higher than it's ever been in U.S. history. We are the envy of the world economically. I heard it this past weekend. I've been hearing it for 6 months now. They would kill to have our inflation rate right now. It's a little hotter. It's not down at 2%, but we're doing so much better than Europe. They're in a total mess there. China is struggling through deflation. They don't know what they're doing. So, I mean, get a paper bag, breathe into it, and understand this, that several years from now, people are going to look back on Joe Biden's record. They're going to look back at, and by the way, this wasn't planned. We were talking about drones. I don't know where this came from, but it's about time we talk about it. More bipartisan legislation passed in the Biden administration than at any time in a generation.
Yeah.
And guess what? Progressives were mocking him. They were ridiculing him. They were saying, old man, those days are past. Don't talk to Republicans. You can't deal with them. And people that supported Donald Trump and were hard right were saying, don't deal with Joe Biden. It will never happen. Well, guess what? It happened. One bipartisan piece of legislation after another. And again, the economy. And as David French, as you pointed out, also more opportunities on the world stage. Yes, for chaos, but also more opportunities for peace, more opportunities for historic generational breakthroughs than ever before.